As the temps start rising, I feel the familiar urge to refresh my closet, but I don't want to waste money on pieces I'll only wear once or for just one season. Thankfully, Quince changes that. Their clothes are timeless, lightweight, and far more elevated than anything else at this price. It finally feels like my wardrobe matches my standards. The best part is that Quince only works with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing practices and premium fabrics and finishes, so you get to look good while feeling good. I'm pretty excited that I have upgraded my athleisure wardrobe for this summer. I bought a sweatshirt and a pair of wide-leg flow pants that are two of the softest items I own, and I plan to live in them. So join me in giving your summer closet an upgrade with Quince. Go to quince.com/POTC for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/POTC to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/POTC.
As a therapist who works with families, the clothing arguments just cause way too much harm to parent-child relationships, particularly mother-daughter relationships or father-daughter relationships, than they should. I tell parents to share their dilemma with them. Say, I want you to be able to wear what you want. You are not responsible for other people's reactions. And yet, some people will judge. So it's important to reflect on what story you want your clothes to tell about you. If her clothing choices are bringing her attention that she doesn't like or makes her feel unsafe, she should listen to those cues. Ultimately, like I said, we're hoping that they will make choices based on their physical and emotional comfort.
That was Joanne Finkelstein on Psychologists Off the Clock.
We are 5 experts in psychology here to bring you cutting-edge and science-based ideas to help you flourish in your relationships, work, and health.
I'm Dr. Debbie Sorensen, a clinical psychologist practicing in Mile High, Denver, Colorado, and author of Act for Burnout, Act Daily Journal, and the Act Daily Card Deck.
From America's Heartland, I'm Dr. Emily Edlin, a clinical psychologist based in Chicago, Illinois, and author of Autonomy Supportive Parenting.
I'm Yael Schongren, a clinical psychologist, faculty at Brown University, author of Work, Parent, Thrive, and a biweekly newsletter on relationships.
Calling in from Vienna, Austria, I'm Michael Herold, a coach, confidence trainer, and author of an upcoming book on being a better conversationalist and making friends.
And from coastal New England, I'm Dr. Jill Stoddard, author of Be Mighty, The Big Book of Act Metaphors, and Imposter No More.
We hope you take what you learn here to build a rich and meaningful life.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock.
Hi, everyone. It's Emily here, and I am so excited to introduce this episode with Joanne Finkelstein about her book, Sexism and Sensibility, about raising empowered and resilient girls in today's society. And this is a very special co-host intro because I drafted the 2 other mothers of daughters on the team, Debbie and Jill, to talk about this episode. So what did you both think?
Well, this is Debbie. I definitely loved the conversation. I think it's so important for us to think about these subtle messages that come through for girls and how we as parents can be more aware of them. And clearly is something I've been thinking about since my kids were little, when you hear this person fixate on how beautiful they are when they're 3 years old and you do a timeout. Hey, hold on. We don't focus on that in this family. And I still learned a lot about just things to pay attention to.
I think that's what got my attention reading the book and having the conversation is I thought I knew everything really going into this. And I talked about that at the beginning of the interview. And yet I feel like my consciousness was raised in really important ways. How about you, Jill?
I totally agree. I'll say my favorite part of the interview was right in the very beginning when Emily reveals something about herself and her name that even Debbie and I didn't know that was a jaw dropper for me. So tune in and you'll get to learn that. But I think I was kind of in the same boat with you, Emily, where I feel like I'm so aware and my eyes are so open. And this really had me thinking about all the ways in which so many of these messages are really insidious. And it reminded me of this post I saw recently. It was Reese Witherspoon, I think, accepting an award. And she was pointing out how often in cartoons and movies and television shows, et cetera, that there's some problem. And the female character turns to the male character and says, what do we do? Whatever shall we do? And they showed clip after clip after clip. And these were not clips from like the 50s and 60s. They were very recent clips. And it blew me away because I never noticed it. And of course, as soon as it was pointed out, I went, oh my gosh, you're right. Like, this is awful. And so this was just kind of a reminder that there is still so much to attend to and to have conversations with our kids about. And one of the things you guys talk about is because things are better. Yes, they're better. That almost results in like okay, so stop talking about it because we're fine now. And we're not fine now. We're getting better, but we still have a long way to go.
And not only that, I'm very disturbed by some of the recent trends toward these misogynistic comments on social media and this very blatant sexism that's going around. And, I've been reading in the news about how young men are sometimes embracing this. And it had me thinking about how it's so important as a parent to be thinking about these things and doing our best at the individual level. But really, to me, there's such a big picture systemic issue going on here that is, we're all going to navigate these tricky waters with our kids, making decisions, thinking about this. And that's really important. But we also have to make the world a better place where our daughters have opportunities and they aren't facing this kind of sexist bullying that you see online. It's just very disturbing to me.
And I realized reading the book and talking with Joanne how even though this book is about raising girls, it is relevant to raising boys, girls, all kids, because they are growing up in this culture that is, like you're mentioning, Debbie, there's this sort of resurgence of very overt misogyny. And not only do we want our girls to not be victimized by that and to have some skills to manage that, we don't want our boys to become part of that explicit misogyny. And part of that is starting with what feels like more subtle messaging and pointing things out. I realize, in the holiday season, we're watching movies, and a lot of these movies like Christmas Vacation, the man is the center, right? And the wife has almost no personality and is just there to support the man. And so it's things like that to just sort of start pointing out. And again, Joanne gives some excellent concrete strategies, what to say, what to point out, how to counter this very insidious sexism in our society. It is nothing new, but I think it's easy to stop seeing it because we're so immersed in it. So I just found this book and this conversation really insightful. So listeners, I hope you feel the same and would love to hear from you after you listen. Hi, everyone. I can't wait to get into this interview today. I have been so excited to speak with Dr. Joanne Finkelstein. Joanne Finkelstein, PhD, is a clinical psychologist and the author of Sexism and Sensibility, Raising Empowered, Resilient Girls in the Modern World. She was educated at Harvard University and Northwestern University and now maintains a private clinical practice. An expert blogger for Psychology Today, her work has been highlighted in the New York Times, The Atlantic, the Harvard Business Review, Oprah Daily, and CNN, among others. Her writing has appeared in The Washington Post, Ms., Your Teen, and other publications. Dr. Finkelstein serves on the advisory board for Stop Sexual Assault in Schools. She lives in Chicago, Illinois. She's a neighbor of mine, sort of. We're only 10 miles away, but probably 45 minutes to an hour, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. But I love Oak Park.
I love Oak Park, too. Come visit me anytime. We'll have coffee.
Sounds fun.
So, welcome, Joanne. It's so nice to have you today.
It's so great to be here.
So, I read a lot of books for this podcast. And sometimes it can feel like being in school again, which is a good thing because I love school. But I have a deadline and I'm taking notes and I highlight and I'm really critically thinking. So it feels like something I have to do is read the book and prepare. But this was different because I loved reading your book so much. I had to pace myself so I wouldn't finish it too soon before we met today. I truly looked forward to each time I sat down to read it.
That is so thrilling to hear from someone who's a psychologist and also a huge reader. That means a ton.
Well, your writing is excellent, which makes the read that much better. But I'll also confess that I was kind of surprised I was so into this book because I felt like I already know what there is to know about feminism and raising girls in our society. Just to give you a little of my personal context of how I came in to this book, I was raised by parents who were strong advocates of feminism from the late 70s. They got married in 1974, and my mother kept her maiden name, which was almost unheard of back then.
Still almost unheard of.
Yes, and my last name is a combination of their middle names. So we had a lot of explaining to do when I was growing up. And I attended a women's college, Smith College, and I'm raising two daughters with my own feminism principles. And so I really was like, I don't know if I have much to learn, right? I thought, I think about this stuff all the time. I always have. But oh my goodness, reading this book, I realized how powerful these anti-feminism messages are in our culture and how much I have been subconsciously soaking them up to be less aware and vigilant in my role as mother. So your book woke me up and lit a bit of a fire, and I have just been talking about it. My kids are starting to roll their eyes a little bit at me, but
so you're doing your job.
Yes, they'll thank me later. So I'm curious, when you decided to write the book, did you feel like you had something new to add to the conversation? Like, where was that for you, and where was the fire that lit you up to write the book?
So I did feel like I had a lot to add to the conversation, but I wasn't sure how I was going to get that across because we have made so much progress, because there are a lot of people who are just like you, true feminists, who I knew I would want to read the book, but I didn't know how I would get across. And I'm still trying to figure out, how do I get across the idea that this book will add value to your life? I guess the thing that made me really want to write the book stems from childhood, which is not surprising to hear coming from a psychologist. And I have 3 brothers, no sisters, and my brothers loved hockey, and I wanted to play too. So I asked my parents for a hockey stick. My parents were not like your parents. But to my delight, they bought me one for my birthday. To my horror, however, it was bright pink and looked like a toy version of my brother's. I have worked with girls and women for the last 24 years in my private practice. And what I discovered is that every girl has a pink hockey stick story, right? Girls constantly get messages that make them feel unseen, unheard, or not taken seriously. And I witness, as I'm sure you do, how harmful these messages are to my patients, sense of self and sense of potential, right? And so there are these spoken and unspoken messages that are like tiny psychological paper cuts that become festering wounds of self-doubt. And so I think even though we all know intellectually that this happens to girls, we don't really understand the effects of it. And in my family, when I would push back or get upset about the gender differences I noticed, my parents insisted that they didn't treat me differently from the boys. Right? Because they were really into fairness, and they just didn't see sort of like feminine, masculine, and splitting that as unfair. So they would tell me that I was being too sensitive or stop being so dramatic, classic comments that we now know girls and women hear a lot. So to avoid criticism, I learned to hide my feelings. And it wasn't until so many years later, too many years later, when I was doing a master's degree that I began to truly understand my experience. Right. I mentioned in a paper for my developmental psychology class, thank you, psychologists, that I'd been accused of overreacting when I felt demeaned. Right. And the professor scribbled in the margin, that's what people say to talk girls out of their feelings. It was such a validating moment for me. right? And validating girls' experiences and opening parents' eyes are two reasons why I wrote the book. So I knew I had something of value. I had personal experience, I had professional experience, and I wanted to put that all in a book.
I realized while I was reading it how I feel like I've had a bit of a second awakening in my 40s, in my midlife, around what it's really like being a woman in our culture. Exactly what you brought up, being silenced, told you're overreacting, too sensitive. Those were messages I got a lot as a child, not from my parents, but from others around me. And I have identified myself as very easygoing and cooperative and empathic and very caring about others. And I'm also people pleasing, right? Like I've taken on the role that you really get into in parts of your book of girls and women are so deeply socialized to prioritize everyone's needs above their own. And it is a little discouraging to think I'm such a feminist and I'm just living this still. You know, I still feel like I don't maybe have the same right to speak up or the same authority in my voice as a man.
Emily, I mean, I wrote a book about sexism and I struggle with the same things. And that is why I want parents to read this book, because it is so much easier to learn sexism and to internalize it than it is to unlearn it later in life.
Yep.
Right. And you're getting at all that healthy entitlement stuff or, lack of healthy entitlement stuff that I talk about in the book, because being called entitled is usually a bad thing, right? Used when we believe someone expects too much.
Right.
But over and over and over again, I see girls in my practice who aren't entitled enough, right? Who lack a healthy sense of entitlement and agency. And to put it into concrete terms, by third grade, girls ask for less than boys. So there's a study that I cite in the book. I mean, there's lots of studies, but I loved this one because it made it so concrete. And it shows you the long-term consequences of this, right? That when children were given the opportunity to negotiate for their favorite stickers, the older girls asked for 2 fewer than the boys, but only when negotiating with a man. And this reflects the same gender gap in negotiation that we see in adults.
Yep.
So what lessons, right, are we imparting to girls subliminally or directly that lead them to believe they deserve less, especially with regard to speaking up, like you were saying, respect, and money? Well, for one, they're often interrupted, right? Statistically speaking, if there are men in your house, your daughter is being interrupted. For two, and you're being interrupted,
right?
And we're interrupting our daughters. For two, we teach them that being liked is more important than being respected. And when it comes to money, we don't talk to them about money, right? Or give them as much money as we do with boys.
Right. I know the data shows that as well. Hi, listeners. It's Emily. You may have heard me reference my small group course, Parent Smarter, Not Harder, and wondered, what is this and how do I find out more? So I carefully designed the 6-session course to meet the needs of parents who are eager to support their children's skills and competence, but don't know how or where to start. We meet virtually for 1 hour a week over 6 consecutive weeks. We not only explore what it means to you to be a good parent, but we set realistic goals for meaningful change. Just listen to what one group member said. I came away from the group coaching experience with a clear framework for making changes at home with confidence that benefit my boys' autonomy and my sanity. Enrollment is officially open only for the month of January, so act now if this sounds like a good fit for you. There are limited spots because I like to keep it small so we can go deep. For more information, visit my website, emilyedlinphd.com/course. Well, let's talk a little bit about the context we're in now, because you do touch on this in the book. There has been a lot of progress. I mean, girls these days are flagging sexism in a way that we never would have in our generation, I don't think, and calling things out and being more aware. I know, for example, I see girls who talk about their periods in front of their dads and brothers. It's just not the same as it was. And I do feel like there has been such significant progress in so many ways. So how would you describe the current kind of condition of where we are with girls and sexism? Well, that's a really big question. I know.
So this also relates to your first question is, did I think I have value? Because girls are so much more feminist than in general than they used to be, because there's progressive educations out there. There's social media that if, they find that algorithm, then they're locked into that. But what I have found is that often that's an identity politic, right? They can say like, my body, my choice.
Yep.
But during, maybe a pressured sexual moment that's happening in real time, it's a totally different story. And so they need us as parents to really have brought sexism out into the open more, to let them know that we are going to have their back no matter what happens, that things are going to happen out there that don't feel good, that they might be blamed for. And also often because they can talk about their periods in front of their dads, although I wrote an article in the Washington Post about how many misconceptions girls still have about periods, specifically due to social media, and about their vaginas and how they have to clean themselves in ways that actually end up hurting them. So that's part A of the question, is that I think that girls really still do need us. Because they use the my body, my choice also for wearing very revealing clothing.
Yes.
I have no problem with that, but I know we'll probably get into that. Mm-hmm. But we want them to ultimately choose to wear what really makes them feel best and most comfortable physically and emotionally. And so they can't do that unless they're really becoming critical consumers of their cultures. And so we need that. But yes, in part B of your question is like, does sexism still exist, right? And we both know that it does. Women continue to be systematically underrepresented in decision-making processes that shape their societies and their lives. So, of course, there's been progress. Men don't legally own us anymore.
Right. We're no longer property.
As of
that stays.
Right. A woman, it's only been, 30, 40 years that husband can't legally rape his wife. Women can work, wear pants, play sports, have their own credit cards, bank accounts, and businesses.
In parts of the world, but not all parts of the world.
Right. In the US, we've come such a long way. And in many ways, right, that's exactly what I'm getting at. We have it. We're better off than women in many other countries. Mm-hmm. The problem is we're supposed to be grateful for what we do have rather than these sort of nagging ingrates who expect full equality. Talk about entitled. So the progress that we've made is used to shut down the work still to be done.
Exactly. That is exactly where I want to go next, because that's a huge theme of your book, is all these ways that our society has shaped to keep women focused on themselves and their interiors rather than have the energy and resources to truly make change in the world. So one place I wanted to start is with a quote that I found especially compelling. Research shows that when people are primed to think women have a chance at attaining equal status with men, they're more likely to indicate women should spend more time on beauty. This is reminiscent of the 1980s when women began flooding the workforce and we added the good mother trope that included an exponential rise in expectations for mothers, ensuring they'll constantly fall short and be self-critical, which is exactly what is happening. So you have a whole chapter about beauty. I know that Sephora has been like the thing for tweens and young teens, just to illustrate how that is still a problem. So can you say a little bit more about how the Eurocentric ideal of beauty serves to oppress women?
Yeah. Beauty culture teaches girls that their most important asset is their appearance. And research shows that most girls, like globally, believe that, right? How sad is that? Mm-hmm. So girls spend nearly double that of boys on their appearance, right? So, while a boy is practicing his instrument, or even if he's playing video games and practicing hand-eye coordination. Girls are, busy trying to fix their so-called flaws, which is an overstatement. And of course, girls are very accomplished, but they do have to spend a lot of time, and more than time, mental energy and finances, right? And their money on fixing these so-called flaws. But also, the more other people focus on their appearance, the more they start to view themselves, right, from an outsider's perspective. So they become really distant from this sort of felt sense of themselves, like really being in their body, and instead focus on how other people perceive their appearance and scent and feel, rather than how it feels for them to be in their own bodies, right? In other words, they start to objectify themselves the way other people objectify them. And this self-objectification can lead to, as you know, habitual self-monitoring and shame and anxiety about their bodies, which puts them at risk for eating disorders, depression, sexual dysfunction. But what I want to get across, beyond the body, it actually steals cognitive resources. So girls who self-objectify have more difficulty getting into flow states, which you need for performance and achievement. Right. So even if you just compliment a girl, you might improve her mood, but you'll impair her mental capacity. Right. So it's worth wondering how often girls receive a body comment right before an important test or a piano recital. Mm-hmm. Right. Like I like to say to parents, think twice before they're running off to school and you want to say, you look so cute.
Right.
But to get to the Eurocentric stuff, right, these girls are in formative stages of identity, and the unabated focus on their appearance is a constant reminder that they're falling short.
Yeah.
Right. So in social media and every type of media, they're seeing these skinny women with radiant skin and cartoonish eyelashes, and they come to think that those appearances are normal and attainable. Right? They're inundated with solutions to their so-called flaws. And meanwhile, like boys, can just sort of take a shower and throw on some comfy clothes and get on with their day.
They're ready in 5 minutes, and girls are waking up earlier. Maybe they're getting less sleep because they take longer to get ready in the morning. I mean, there are all these implications. One thing I thought of when you were talking about performance as well as, and the Eurocentric ideal and how this all intersects, is the criticism Simone Biles had for her hair in the Olympics. I mean, to me, that is misogyny, right? And racism. She is maybe the greatest athlete of all time. There could be an argument for that. And yet, the focus was criticism of her hair.
Yeah. I mean, you see that right across the board. Like any woman who has the audacity, quote unquote, to put herself in the public eye is going to be torn apart for her looks.
Yep.
Right. And especially if you don't fit the Eurocentric ideal of whiteness, skinniness, blonde hair, silky hair, straight hair, for sure. And I mean, in the book, right, the whole beauty chapter is around Geneva, who is biracial. And you see her in so many different ways trying to fit into these different cultures, but especially, she goes to a predominantly white school until high school. And so she's so confused about what beautiful is. And as you know, right, she ends up becoming a dancer who takes off her clothes. And there's a lot of work that we do together in my practice for her to get back to who she is as a person of mixed race and not trying to fit into some very narrow ideal, both in beauty and in how she expresses herself.
So what can parents do or other adults in children's lives to counter this self-objectification?
I always hesitate around this because, I want to say don't focus on their appearance. And yet I understand that it is so natural for us to tell our children they're beautiful because we think they're beautiful.
Yeah.
Right. But especially when it comes to girls, notice how you do it so much more with your daughters than with your sons, right? Yep. So it's really important to, as much as possible, take a body neutral stance and focus so much more on their character and, the things that they can build and change, not the things that they were born with or, that they have to apply in a mirror. The other thing is to really help them become critical of the culture and help them notice how often girls' appearance is both held up as important and torn apart as not good enough. Help them on, we can get into every aspect of their lives, social media, right? Like see what accounts they're following. Ask them to tune into themselves when they're scrolling. Like, does this account make you feel bad about your body? Because maybe you want to unfollow it.
Right.
If it's one of your friends, it might not be so easy. But, you can follow more body positive accounts so that the algorithm helps feed you more body positive stuff like that. So I think it's just a lot of talking to our kids. And this is sometimes where the eye rolls come in about, how, like as I once said to my own daughter, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. I think this is in the book, right?
Yeah.
A cigar is just a cigar, but crop tops, Brazilian wax, and dieting are never as simple as free choice.
Right.
So what we're trying to drive home is that what they see as free choice is not always as free as they think, and that they are going to be told that their looks are broken, that their appearance isn't good enough. But we want them to know they are not broken. The culture is broken.
This is the perfect segue to talk about media. And you have a whole chapter about this. I think this was really important. And I want to highlight the 3 themes that you identify. One is that girls and women are underrepresented in media. 2 is females and males are systematically portrayed in stereotypical ways in the media. And 3 is normalization of traditional gender roles and violence against women in relationships. And that's one I'm especially attuned to, even as my daughters are 15 and 13. And so they're starting to watch things like Gossip Girl. And I have actually never watched that. But what I worry about, even with these popular teenage soap operas, is the hetero relationship dynamics and how I'm sure the girls are playing the traditional passive roles and the males are playing the traditional stereotypical kind of in control of the relationship roles. And that does concern me. I mean, all of this concerns me. But you point out there's this really tricky balance around kind of helping our teens navigate their media consumption without them feeling criticized and judged, right? So what's your guidance around that?
I did not actually set out to write a parenting book because I think there's too many parenting books out there that make parents feel like they're doing it wrong.
Yes.
And so I had actually wanted to write a book for adolescent girls. And then I realized, okay, most adolescent girls aren't reading cultural criticism. So the next best is their parents who will talk to them about all this stuff. And so that's just my caveat. I am not here to make parents feel bad. My kids watched plenty of TV by themselves when they were growing up. But when you are co-watching, because that does happen, that is the time to really use these as teachable moments, right? Like, so when they're young, it might look something like, you might think because so many girls use magic to solve problems while boys use STEM and their physicality. I mean, you choose other words, but that is what is happening on cartoons and other things. Girls use magic and boys use STEM and their physicality. So you might say, it might seem like girls can't solve problems because like real girls don't have magic, but we know girls are clever, fast on their feet, good at science, whatever it is too. So you're starting to help them become critical of what they're looking at, right? We want to induce a healthy skepticism for every single thing they watch on TV and on social media. And kids who are, 9 to 12, they really love watching TV with their parents. And so that's a really great time to point out the stuff that you're seeing, or that you're imagining is happening on those shows, to say, boy, like she is, Buffy really is super strong and badass. But at the same time, nobody changes their clothes that much. Nobody has that many gorgeous clothes. Like that is just a way that girls have to be on television, right? And that it's such a focus on girls' appearance, even though she's this strong, amazing young woman. And then when they're watching it alone, right, sometimes it's good to pop in, right? Like my daughter she loved Friends, which was a show I loved in the 90s. And yet it's kind of mortifying, right?
Watching
How
it
much
now.
fat phobia and racism and sexism. I mean, it is mortifying. So this is where I was able to find I could walk the balance, because it also was really funny. Like I couldn't help but laugh. But then I'd say, oof, that joke really doesn't land anymore. I mean, that's pretty, and so we'd have these conversations. And so I think basically, what you're talking about at the dinner table, even if it's not specifically about their shows, it's going to translate. And you can ask them, like, so I wonder what themes you guys are seeing that can sort of come across as funny, but that are also pretty offensive. And just have, when you're not making it about them personally, their clothes, their shows, and you're having these more abstract conversations, I find that you really can get them talking.
A series that was recently out on Netflix that was an excellent conversation starter was the Dallas Cowboy Cheerleaders documentary. And I mean, this gets at so much of what we're talking about in terms of the objectification of women and their value and where their sense of self-worth is rooted. And so each of my daughters had watched it, and I didn't really want to watch it. I'm not really a fan of the whole archetype of cheerleaders, but I was like, I think I'm going to watch it since they've watched it. So I watched it, and then we were able to talk about it very specifically. And because it was such a contemporary kind of like in the moment show that everyone was talking about at once, it was an easy conversation to have. But it was actually reassuring to me that they were able to pull out the themes of how objectified the women were, as well as kind of sad, like their emotional lives were rough. Yeah. And so it was that was a good conversation starter for that age group too.
And I think the same goes for influencers, right? Like we are all so influenced by influencers. But what's coming out now is how rough their personal lives are, right? Like it's so hard to keep up the facade, and they're often harassed. And so I like to bring that into conversations too, because it looks like, see, if you are pretty, the algorithms will raise you up, and you will make perhaps a ton of money. Like it all looks so perfect and good. And then when you get underneath the surface, it really isn't.
Yep. That is an excellent conversation to have. There's also a good documentary about that, which I cannot remember the name of, but where it showed kind of the behind the scenes of the constant pressure of getting the attention on the social media platform once you're successful, and how psychologically really challenging that was. So I think this is getting at this idea that there's ways we can use media rather than feeling used by media if we kind of flip it a little bit around. This is a good vehicle for these discussions.
It's a great vehicle. And it's the one that I always suggest parents start with if they have younger kids, because it's, you want to make, media literacy is very important, but it's also just a vehicle to the whole culture, so that when they are watching media and out in the world on their own, they have those critical thinking skills.
So I want to get back to the theme of entitlement and finding her voice. And we touched on some of this. You already brought up a study around as early as third grade, girls begin to ask for less than boys with the stickers. We talked about how men talk more and interrupt women more than they interrupt other men. One thing you mentioned that was so interesting to me is that female Supreme Court justices are 3 times more likely to suffer interruptions than their male colleagues. And that is, the height of accomplishment in that field. And yet the pattern persists.
And all they have, in that particular situation, all they have are their verbal arguments. So if they're not being heard, they're having less of an influence.
Yes, it's very, very striking. And I know, my awakening around that was when I went to college at a women's college. I immediately realized how much more I was participating and how everyone was participating. And then when I would be in co-ed social groups again, I would realize how much the men were dominating the conversations. And this was, we were 18, 19, 20. And it was so clear to me once I had that contrast.
And that is why I want my daughter to go to Smith. But that's for
Do
another
you?
conversation. I do have a not so secret wish for that.
It's a great school. So I think this is just such an important part of your topic and your messaging. And I really liked how you identified 5 different voices, if you don't mind us going through them.
Sure.
So one is the voice of integrity. And you mentioned that as well, where we are socialized to trade being liked for being respected. Second is the voice of resistance. We are socialized to not disagree, and we need to learn how to be real and respectful when disagreeing. You have the voice of ambition, so tolerating competition and envy. The voice of authority, this one is so important. Being a good girl means minimizing skill and authority, and this includes things like untitling and uncredentialing. I know my husband and I have the exact same degree, and we'll get mail from our alma mater that calls him doctor and me PhD, which they still have the PhD, but it's just an interesting difference.
So interesting.
And then finally, the voice of economic self-sufficiency. So I think this is an excellent framework of these specific areas that we can be really mindful of as parents, of where we need to work with our daughters and be very conscious of how we can promote and work against these social trends. So what stands out to you with these voices, or what have you found the most kind of powerful part of this messaging when you talk to girls and parents?
I think just the idea of having a voice. We teach girls, it is their job to make everyone happy, to be liked, to swallow their anger, and so on, right? So there's this very narrow range of acceptable girl voices that straitjackets them and undermines how they're regarded. I guess I find them all to be powerful. One of the ones that we can do as parents is work with their voice. So when they're younger, notice that they're being interrupted, because they probably are, like I said, right? So for my own daughter, we were sitting at the dinner table, and I was noticing how often my son dominates conversations. He's a really, he's a great kid. He's a smart kid. He's a political kid. Like, he has a lot to say. And my daughter is more soft-spoken. But he did a lot of interrupting. And so I intervened, right? And I was very careful not to shame him, because I don't want to, make him feel ashamed for having a strong voice and for being male and all of that stuff that comes along with trying to. But, so I said, "Hey, Gabs, I see you're being interrupted, sometimes by me. And I want you to know, that's not okay. And we need to work on that. But I also want you to know that you can say, 'Hey, I'm speaking.'
Yep.
Or 'Let me finish and then you can speak.'"
Yep.
The bit of the Kamala Harris, phrases. "I'm speaking."
Yes.
Right. And so I gave her actual phrases. And I also was able to turn to my son and say, "You're not doing this on purpose by any means. I know that." But often what happens in our society is that boys interrupt girls, or girls get interrupted more than boys do, right? Because I'm interrupting too. And so I just want you to be mindful of making space for people who have less of a voice in this culture. So that's one thing, right? And then the other thing, as they get older, is the voice of resistance, right? Is allowing them to have that voice in our homes, because suddenly, we bring them up to be so good, and then they become these squirrely teenagers, and it can be hard to tolerate their anger and bad attitudes, which doesn't mean tolerate rudeness, but It does mean noticing when you are shutting down their anger. Like, I had a mom, a self-identified feminist mom, who wrote to me after she read my book and said, "Oh my God, your book made me realize that I have been shutting down my daughter's opinions." My daughter's 14, I think was her age. And she's gotten more opinionated, but she's not nearly as opinionated or critical as my son. And yet I'm shutting down her opinions. She went to her daughter, right, and said, "I think this is happening." And her daughter cried from the recognition because she knew something was wrong. She would say, "You never listened to me," but that wasn't quite it. But this pinpointed what was happening, right? And there's a story in the book of a patient who came into therapy because she's like, I'm smart. I get good grades. She was a freshman in college. And she's like, but like when I get out in public or when I'm not around my good friends or at work, I just feel like I'm not articulate. People interrupt me. And through our work together, she started to say, "You know what? My parents had eyes for me and ears for my brother." It felt like they listened to her brother, but for her, they nitpick or complimented her appearance constantly, and that was what mattered. And so she grew up feeling like she didn't have much to say. And so we want our daughters to always know, you have such a beautiful mind. I want to hear more.
Yes. The real consequence of all of this is that boys learn to trust their own voices and girls doubt theirs, which I'm paraphrasing what you wrote. But the problem here, again, is this idea that the self-doubt, the uncertainty, the lack of sense of self because of these messages around, you don't have an important enough voice.
Yeah. I mean, 50%, nearly 50% of girls believe they'll be unlikable if they speak up.
Wow. Could we take a moment to really pull out fathers in this too? Because there does seem to be this continued dynamic of, there can be a lot of arguing and debating with mom, but don't talk back to your father. This kind of binary, it's not true in my family, but it's common. So what can fathers do in this situation when their daughters are expressing opinions and disagreements?
I mean, that's part of, right, tolerating anger or strong opinions. It's so important that fathers do that because fathers, they want to protect their girls, right? They want them to grow up not only feeling equal, but feeling like they can speak up in the face of mistreatment.
Yep.
And so I think a dad really has to say, to invite his daughter to debate with him and to really recognize the difference between when she's being assertive and when she's being aggressive and rude. Because I think often in this culture, we do not differentiate between those two when it comes to women. And so dads can often be in that position of feeling attacked when they're actually not being attacked. And it doesn't mean they can't say, like, I want to hear what you have to say, but it does feel aggressive. And so can you say it in a different way? But also notice if it is just feeling aggressive when it is not aggressive.
Well, I think an interesting mental exercise for parents who have sons and daughters is to think, if this interaction were happening with my son, would I react differently?
And would I have said that? The word hysterical comes to mind.
Oh. Yes.
Right. There's so many words that we would never use for boys and men. And so if you don't use it for boys and men, don't use it for girls and women.
Yep. And dramatic. That's another one.
Mm-hmm.
So let's flow into, again, why this is so important. And you just touched on how our interactions with our kids are setting them up to be more protected or more vulnerable out in the world. And so actually speaking up with us is a really good protective skill in the world. So your chapter is titled From Gender Bias and Sexism to Sexual Harassment and Assault. So this is really the linear, concrete outcome in some ways of living in this culture just soaked in sexism, is that women are at much higher risk for sexual assault and sexual harassment. Let's just lay the foundation, even though it's hard to talk about. What do we know from the statistics?
By the end of high school, 90% of teenage girls will be harassed. And this one kind of got me, right? 33%. So 1 in 3 girls will experience dating violence, right? Whether it's physical, emotional, or verbal. 27%, compared with 5% of boys, can expect to be sexually abused or assaulted before they turn 18. So the statistic for being physically forced to have sex is 14%. And we know it's probably higher because so much reporting doesn't go on.
So you touch on how it can be this really tricky balance of how we talk with our children and coach them around boundaries and protecting themselves without falling into the victim blaming, the because you wore a crop top, you were catcalled. So let's talk more about that tricky balance.
Yeah, let's talk about that. I mean, that's probably like the most common dynamic that people ask me about. Like, my daughter is wearing such revealing clothing, right? And I get it. Like, it can be jarring to see our daughters in skimpy clothing, but we've got to learn how to talk about it with them, because we think we're protecting them. But if we say something, we risk shaming them or making them afraid of their bodies and their sexuality, and that's just one way that we think we're protecting them, by focusing on, right? Like, we do that with their looks, their weight, rather than focusing on how the culture views them and treats them. And when we talk about one without the other, then it can feel like we're blaming them, right? So I tell parents to share their dilemma with them, say, I want you to be able to wear what you want. You are not responsible for other people's reactions. And yet, some people will judge. So it's important to reflect on what story you want your clothes to tell about you. If her clothing choices are bringing her attention that she doesn't like or makes her feel unsafe, she should listen to those cues. Ultimately, like I said, we're hoping that they will make choices based on their physical and emotional comfort. But if she does choose to emphasize her body, we need to remember that girls in everything from bikinis to burqas get harassed and assaulted, right? There's no research that says certain clothing makes it more likely. And the truth is, just one more thing, they're often more interested in being fashionable, not sexy.
Right. Like, we impose the sexual part on to their clothing choices, and many times.
Right. Skimpy is what teen brands are selling,
Yep.
and they want to fit in.
Yep. I know. So recently, one of my daughters went to her friend's bat mitzvah, and she got a dress that was very tiny, very short and tight and tiny. And I was like, okay. And then I saw a picture of her with her friends, and it was like identical. They all had the short, tight, tiny dresses. And so I think it is hard to just kind of know what is the drive. And we don't want to impose a sexual meaning to their choices that's not there. And that's one reason when my girls were 10, they started wearing crop tops. And I did kind of make a conscious choice to not call attention to it.
It's hard because we know that as they develop and start to wear skimpier clothes, that could draw the attention of older men who should not be looking at young children. We don't want our kids catcalled. We know what it feels like, but they're doing it because they want to fit in, because they're told this is what looks good. And yes, hopefully one day that energy will be less dictated by a male gaze. We want our kids to embrace their budding sexuality, right? Or at least be unashamed of it.
Right.
And at the same time, seeing themselves, as parents, we know that seeing themselves through a system that values young women packaged for the marketplace of male desire leaves little room for pimples and tummy rolls. So we're always walking this line. I will just say, as a therapist who works with families, the clothing arguments just cause way too much harm to parent-child relationships, particularly mother-daughter relationships or father-daughter relationships, than they should.
That's a really good point. I think that's a very concrete take-home for listeners, because I hear from a lot of parents about this struggle. And I hear, oh, my daughter walked down the stairs and I said, turn right back around, put on some clothes. Right?
And then they get self-conscious and defensive. And
And it's from a place of protection. There's no doubt about that. But I think the take-home message from all of this is also the importance of discussion and conversation and ongoing awareness building for our girls around how they're sexualized and objectified, and how we're going to treat them in a way that helps them at least be aware of it. And you talk about sexism detectors, right? Building their sexism detectors. And that is ultimately what helps them be more protected than what kind of clothing they're wearing.
Right. And I always like to remind parents that we are playing the long game here. Of course, if you actually are worried about their safety, there's no long game, right? But we want to be talking about these things so that they can protect themselves. So if they are wearing that tiny dress and they're going on the train, okay, maybe they throw that long sweatshirt over it. But we are playing the long game so that hopefully over time, they will be able to feel critical of the culture, not of themselves, so that they know that the culture is broken, that how they are treated is broken, not who they are is broken.
Oh, Joanne, that is the perfect ending point. I so wish we had more time.
Me too.
I just want to tease the listeners that you have a chapter called Sex and Pizza. So, I mean, who doesn't want to read that chapter? But I do think there is so much more we didn't get to around girls' sexuality and how to navigate sex with our daughters in a way that sets them up for a healthier sexuality as women, which I think a lot of women can probably relate to, is very hard to come by in our culture. So I just really encourage listeners to check out this book. I have been, like I said, so excited to talk to you about it. I have so much more to say, but maybe we'll get together for coffee and we can talk about Smith and I can ask you more questions.
That sounds fabulous. I'd love to.
So where can listeners find you, Joanne?
You can find everything you need to know at joannefinkelstein.com. I'm also on TikTok and Instagram at joannefinkelstein.phd. And I have a newsletter, a Substack. That's joannefinkelstein.substack.com.
I love the Substack and I am very impressed you're on TikTok. I haven't been able to bring myself to do it. So
yeah, it's a newish thing, and social media isn't my favorite, but it's been getting a little more fun as I go along. And
good, it's a good place to reach teenage girls. So
yeah,
it's your audience.
Exactly.
All right, Joanne, thank you so much for coming on to Psychologists Off the Clock.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. If you enjoy our podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review or contributing on Patreon.
You can get more psychology tips by subscribing to our newsletter and connecting with us on social media.
We'd like to thank our podcast production manager, Jadine Stout-Williams.
This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatment. If you're looking for mental health treatment, please visit the resources page of our website, offtheclockpsych.com.